Perfect. We've got you now. Excellent. So it's 2 minutes past 7. We'll kick off, and if anybody else joins, that's great. So obviously, Simon and John particularly send their apologies today because they really wanted to be here. And I know Simon particularly is very interested in art. So I know he was looking forward to this, Fleur. So the good news is that we're going to record this because there's a few people that have signed up that actually can't be with us this evening, but they do want to watch it offline. So I've got this recording onto my desktop, and we'll post it on YouTube at some point later on. But as I say, there were a few people that were signed up that couldn't make it. But it's great to welcome Fleur Dorrell. She is, her title, I think, is the Scripture Engagement Manager for the Bible Society and the Bishops' Conference, which sounds a very interesting title, which maybe you can tell us about, Fleur, when we get there. And obviously this evening's is one of the pop-up workshops on the Bible and art. And as most of you who know me know, I'm from Liverpool and not very cultured. I don't know much about art at all, but I am quite fascinated by it. And I did read I didn't read a paper that Fleur wrote called Alchemy for the Masses, which I think you wrote in 2020.
This year, it was for the pandemic for this year.
Oh, was it? Okay. Which is, I think it's worth reading. Not that I know anything about art, but I think it's worth reading. The nice thing I did get from it was the summary at the end. And if I could just pick up a few points, and the way we sort of try and, or the way maybe we should be thinking about art this evening, there were some areas that Fleur identified in this paper that art can help promote. You may not remember this, Fleur, but at the end of it, there was a summary. And there were things that struck me where art can promote in capacity a sense of awe, wonder, and mystery. There is more to things that meet the eye. That was one of the points she made. A second capacity was a sense that the past and the familiar can teach us as much as the new and the glamorous, which was a second capacity. And the third was art can give us a real awareness of the natural world and its capacity to point beyond itself. So there's a whole sort of area of art here that you can start thinking way outside of what perhaps we limit ourselves to. But there are also some skills, I think, when we look at art, and maybe Fleur, you'll cover some of these things as we go through the paintings. The skills were, one was an ability to be still and to look carefully, which I think is a really important quality that we all need to develop. The second was an ability to think and respond with sensitivity and imagination. And the third, I guess, with art was an ability to cope with paradox and contradiction. So that was sort of my summary of some of the stuff that Fleur has written, and maybe gives you some insight into some of her thinking. And now we'll hand over to Fleur and she'll take us through some slides, and we welcome you.
Thank you. It's great to be with you. Right, can you all see my slides? Is that okay?
Yes.
And can you hear me clearly, or is there any echoing or anything? You're okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll
Yes.
kick off then. So, how can we envisage God who is beyond all imagining? In what form or forms does God reveal his nature and purpose to us? Is what we create, even if superb by our aesthetic standards, anywhere near to what God actually is or looks like? Or are we only ever seeing and creating images of God through a glass darkly? What does God say or do to make himself known to us? Well, right at the beginning of Genesis, God creates the world, so we know that creativity is a part of the divine. The incarnation of Jesus becomes God's most personal creative act. And Jesus says, "He who has seen me has seen the Father," in John 14, verse 9. So we know that to know Jesus gives us an idea of who God is too. In this talk, I'm limiting myself to paintings only rather than the wider arts, but I want to explore some ways and styles in which God speaks to us through this art. And I'm going to look at several artists who use the Bible to show us three things: how God communicates through unusual means, how God gives us choices in life, and how God shows us mercy and love. Trying to move on. This is not moving on. Didn't have this problem. Has that moved on now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, I don't know why it's slow, but anyway, okay. Right, so first, visual art has been in the collective mind of our church for nearly as long as Christianity has existed. But how to depict important Christian figures and Bible stories is much more complicated. And we could broadly say that up to the 19th century, there were 4 dimensions to religious art. And these dimensions are iconographic, didactic, institutional, and aesthetic. Now, these 4 dimensions have a particular set of characteristics, but they share a common premise, that religious and biblical art is a door to salvation. But the problems with these dimensions and their doors is when people try to hide the keys, those people who try to control access to salvation by limiting God both on and off the canvas. And with those who believe that art has no place in our faith, and those who worship the biblical text or the image more than the God who inspired them. Now, during the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Church realised that its artistic heritage was one of its key marketing tools to inspire Catholics to stay on board. But it went too far in trying to control its artistic output, and the Council of Trent issued new rules on what could be painted or portrayed visually, and not just on the techniques permitted, but the colours you were allowed to use. And people such as Caravaggio knew of these instructions, as they were called, but decided to reinterpret them to suit their own style. And of course, this caused scandal, particularly when Caravaggio used real people off the streets to model as the Holy Family, biblical figures, and saints. This was seen by the Catholic Church as blasphemous. Yet he shaped a new movement in art in which perceived beauty and elegance competed with the now central ambition of bringing emotion to the fore, thus heightening the drama and making biblical art more real and more accessible to all of us. Also, the development of Ignatian spirituality using all 5 senses also enabled Christians to feel and imagine the Bible stories and of Christ's life in the paintings they saw each week in church, rather than simply to stare at them at psychological and devotional arm's length. Pandora's box took the scriptural lid off everything. Tears, fears, wounds, pain, ecstasy, drama, colour, caution, kindness, compassion, violence, bloodshed, pity, hope, joy, humility, doubt, despair, horror, loyalty, betrayal, and faith, it all poured out, and it urged the painter and the viewer and believer to respond in kind, or as we would now say, #every emotion. Art was no longer just piety in 2 dimensions. It was a real beating sacred heart. God spoke to us with energy and emotion, the Bible in transit, not just in the musty past. Passion and compassion covered the canvas. How could we resist God now? And the highest degree of divine revelation possible on earth was brought to the easel. Christian artists all tried to perfect this. Michelangelo and Raphael took us to heaven, while the 2 Bruegels brought us down to earth. And Rembrandt took us to see inside our souls. We could now be briefly transported to heaven or hell, but either way, it provided a sneak preview in real time. But how you portray the divine remains the most difficult artistic challenge. How do you depict Jesus as both God and man simultaneously? Should he be naked, as in the 9th century Ravenna baptistry, or clothed, as the Victorians insisted? Do you depict Jesus while dying on the cross, or already dead on the cross? The medieval interest in Christ's body dominated our spirituality. The cross wasn't just an event we reenacted in every Eucharist. Its visual representation could be repeated and remembered in other forms. So it became portable and translatable. And we still wear crosses now for that very reason. But there was another journey going on too, from early Christian art to Renaissance perfection to completely abstracted art is quite a journey visually and theologically. But the test must always be the same with this kind of art in any age or style. Does it engage us? What do we feel and want to do when we look at it? Do we turn to or away from God? So let's look at our first theme, how God communicates through unusual means. And here we have a very standard Italian image of the story of Elijah being fed by a raven by the Italian artist Lazzaro Baldi. Now, let's compare this with a much more exciting interpretation by the contemporary Welsh artist Clive Hicks Jenkins, The Prophet Fed by a Raven, and just maybe spend a minute just comparing these two, the same story.
Oh, exciting, that one, isn't it?
So I'll just move on so you get him again. So if all prophets look like this, perhaps more people would listen to them. Inspired by this encounter the great Old Testament prophet has with the raven in 1 Kings 17, this artist for me certainly brings this story truly alive. Elijah's magnificent bird beats online deliveries since his food comes straight from God. If you're going to be a prophet, you need energy. And as the story goes, after this raven, an angel takes over the catering in 1 Kings 19. So already the natural and the supernatural collide in God's holy plan. This scarlet pimpernel occupies more than half the canvas as its blazing presence ignites Elijah's desire to obey God's words. Mesmerized by form and shape, this Kerith crow was made for show. Its colossal and ribboned feathers are trimmed with tassels and a tufted front. Any angel worth its salt will be definitely waiting in the wings. So far, this might sound like a day trip to a bird hide, except the ravens are scavengers, and the Jewish religion believed them to be extremely unclean. Why then would God send these pesky polluters to babysit one of his top prophets? Knowing this, Elijah can't have been impressed initially. But once again, God does the exact opposite of what his faithful followers understand about him. As if being hidden in a cold cave in the middle of absolutely nowhere with no real plan wasn't tough enough, to rely on your takeaways from the very carrion you despise just takes the biscuit. No discussion, no extra snacks, 2 meals per day. God knows what we need, even when we think we know better. In the midst of this mystery, Hicks Jenkins reminds us that while a prophet might not be welcome in any age, his message speaks for all time. So Elijah's jeans and a mug of tea are a classic Western trope here. Moody in moonlight with his hunk of bread, the prophet has much to mull. The raven might not be as Welsh as the landscape or the beasts of its own myths or its artist, but its sapphire eyes and upturned beak comfort its guest as he takes a break. Here, man and nature are working together, and in this way, they are both on the same footing. Neither has the upper hand when they collaborate with creation. The Bible is full of stories that defy logic, and in this prophetic episode, Elijah has to face not just dependency on the elements for his survival, but on God for his direction. The fact that God will provide through some unusual means only heightens the story further. The raven is the first bird to be mentioned in the Bible, in the Noah story, but usually we observe ravens today as hefty blackbirds with negative attributes symbolizing impending or actual death. Yet this raven offers us a considered critique on compassion and companionship. The prophetic perch reminds us that faith is fragile, but if we fall, we can still be saved. Those metallic talons know just how to catch. God works with everything and nothing, so our offering can always become something. The earth is not just turning on its axis between night and day here, it is tending to its inhabitants, both friend and foul. The cycle of creation is complete in its covenant of care. Hicks Jenkins' illustrated Elijah is not old and world-weary like our first Italian painting, or gnarled of face with scraggy beard and weathered hands. He is young and muscular, smooth-shaven and pensive. By revising the stereotype, a prophet can appear in any guise and at any time. Sometimes it is nature that heeds the call long before humanity has recognized the divine embrace. And this is partly what our climate change crisis is teaching us right now. So our second theme, God gives us choices in life. So here we see Vermeer, woman holding a balance. So we're in 17th century Holland at the height of the Dutch Golden Age. Dutch trade, Dutch scientific discoveries, military and art were some of the most acclaimed in the world. Holland is doing very well. Christianity is changing and there are new ways to portray the Bible. So for 300 years, this picture was actually known as either the gold weigher or girl weighing pearls. There were similar paintings of this genre which led to those confusing titles such as these two by Teniers and Pieter de Hoogh. Weighing money, gold or jewellery were common themes for artists to paint because of the increased commercial and seafaring expansion, which later led to the Dutch East Indies. Now the word value in the 17th century was used only to denote monetary worth, whereas now we often use the word value or values to mean anything from our ethos, principles, or virtues. And the idea of Western values is a very recent concept dating from the 1950s. So is this painting about the value of money, material goods, or something else? What has it got to do with the Bible? Microscopic analysis of this painting has revealed the pans in the middle to be empty, and there are no loose pearls on the table that would indicate other pearls waiting to be weighed. This might seem trivial, but it's the key to this painting's true meaning and purpose. What is being weighed, which appears to be absolutely nothing, bears significantly on the meaning of the work, as does the painting behind the woman, which provides us with our answer. For woman holding a balance, as it's now called, is overtly allegorical and biblical. The woman stands between a painting of the Last Judgment hung in a heavy black frame in which souls are being weighed, and a table covered with jewellery representing material possessions. The empty weighing scale stressed that she's balancing spiritual rather than material considerations. Notice she's not wearing any jewellery or are drawing attention to herself in the mirror at the top left, unlike mirrors in many paintings which normally denote vanity. This mirror therefore symbolises self-knowledge, since here what she's weighing is the meaning of her own actions. She's weighing a decision she must make about how she lives her life. Is she perhaps pregnant, full with new life, while her weighing scales stand empty? This isn't clear, as there were very few paintings of pregnant women at this time, nor is it clear whether she was indeed married. Dutch women wear their red wedding ring on the right hand, so again, we don't have a clue to that either. What we do know is that Vermeer is showing us that a moderate, balanced life leads to salvation. The calmness of the woman shows that she is able to do this and has chosen the right path. Notice there's no tension here, despite the graphic road to hell for some of the poor people in the painting behind her. While they will burn in eternal damnation depending on one's theology, she doesn't even flinch. The woman exudes serenity and the painting exudes harmony. This harmony lies in its mathematical composition. Our attention focuses on the delicate balance, which is dead center. The woman's left hand rests on the table to steady her right hand, and her body unites the spiritual painting behind her with the earthly weighing scales in front of her. The complex interplay between these verticals and horizontals, objects and negative space, light and shadow, all result in a strongly balanced yet active picture, and are hallmarks of most of Vermeer's paintings. So what about the painting behind the woman? Few truths are clearer in the Bible than that of the Last Judgment, it might seem to many, since it gets such good coverage. The Old Testament prophets speak of the day of the Lord, especially in Joel, Ezekiel, and Isaiah. In the New Testament, we're told about the second coming of Christ as judge of the world. Jesus describes this in Matthew 24 and 25, with warnings of false prophets, people losing their faith, war being waged, and the church being persecuted, all while Satan thrives. Mark, Luke, and John talk about the day of the Lord, the day of Christ, the Son of Man, and the last day. And the apostles preach about it in Acts. The Last Judgment is also mentioned in Romans, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Philippians, 2 Timothy, 2 Thessalonians, James, Titus, Jude, Hebrews, 1 Peter, and of course in spectacular fashion in Revelation. It's also in the Apostles' Creed, as Jesus ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father, and he will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead. The actual date and time of the Last Judgment, of course, we do not know, but we do know that hell is not a trusted meeting place. Now, normally in Last Judgment paintings, Michael the Archangel is weighing the souls, but here Vermeer purposely places the woman in front of the painting where Michael would be, to show that she's taking responsibility not for the weighing of her own soul, but of balancing her own judgments. Vermeer shows us a window into a woman's heart and asks us to reflect on our life too. Sometimes life really weighs us down. Other times we feel light and free. And this autumn, we may want to reflect on the balance or lack of it in our own lives through this painting. Our third theme, God shows us mercy. The Merciful Night by the Pre-Raphaelite artist Edward Burne-Jones. This picture is based on an 11th century legend retold by Sir Kenelm Digby in the book The Broadstone of Honour, which is a guide to being an English gentleman and parallels the 8 Beatitudes with 8 aspects of chivalry. Now, the book's hero is a Florentine knight called John Galbert, who was a 10th century Italian saint and Florentine nobleman. One Good Friday, he was entering Florence with a small army, when in a narrow lane, he came upon a man who had killed his brother. He was about to kill the man in revenge, when the perpetrator fell upon his knees with arms outstretched in the form of a cross and begged for mercy in the name of Christ, who had been crucified that very day. John forgave him, and then he entered the Benedictine church at San Miniato to pray, and the figure on the crucifix in front of him bowed its head to him in recognition of his generosity. John Galbert was later canonized. This is one of Burne-Jones' most important early works, but it was strongly criticised for being too obscure. It remained Burne-Jones' own favourite among his early works because of his interest in chivalry. In Burne-Jones' preliminary sketches for this painting, the kiss given by Christ is far more passionate, and Christ is standing on an altar. In this finished version, this kiss becomes more protective and deeply caring. And we see that the altar is a wooden platform, but retains the angels guarding each corner of the roof in the shadow. The beard of Christ here provides a shield over the knight's forehead and over his inexpressibly sad face. The wounds in Christ's hands draw attention to the vulnerability of the knight's exposed hands, whose armoured gauntlets hang from his waist. The marigolds in the foreground come from Russell Square, London, close to Burne-Jones's house opposite the British Museum. And on the top right corner, we see the enemy riding away. He is saved from death by this holy knight. So I'll just take a closer look at it. And we see in this closer shot how far over Christ leans to hold the knight. The knight is in full armour, Christ is almost naked. The knight has his helmet and sword laid down before him in reverence and peace. Christ wears a crown of thorns with the nails of the cross still in his feet. And we know that in one sense, this position of Christ could never happen. It's not physically or physiologically possible to lean that forward while still being nailed to the cross. And if you could, your flesh would rip even more. But here we see Christ so composed and so calm. No wonder this knight is rattling in his metallic uniform. You can almost hear his nervousness. He kneels in fear and trembling and shaking non-stop. Because no matter how many medieval battles this knight has fought, he's never seen anything like this before. So God speaks to us through mercy. As if dying on the cross wasn't enough, this Jesus goes even further with his body and with his love. He extends his pain by embracing our much smaller gifts of forgiveness and reaches out to love and hold us even more. Our next painting on mercy is by the lesser well-known Pre-Raphaelite artist Arthur Hughes. He never got the same critical fame that many of the other Pre-Raphaelites achieved, yet produced some highly delicate and popular artworks. As with the rest of the Pre-Raphaelites, Hughes loved returning to biblical messages and stories to inspire his work. And part of his technique was to use scriptural references on the paintings themselves, rather than just make the viewer guess which story or text was being interpreted. So here we see the door of mercy. Now the door frame has a quote from Luke's Gospel 15 verses 7 to 9. There is joy in the presence of God over one sinner. There is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner that repenteth. And we know that this comes in Luke's Gospel among the other stories of mercy, the parable of the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the prodigal son. And below it, you can see that there is a quote from Isaiah 1:18. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. So we have two visual references from the Bible on this painting. The angels rejoicing and making music in heaven, and the woman wearing the red dress with thorns around her legs, looking down in penitence as she's too ashamed to face the angel's mercy. This painting also alludes to Psalm 51, which has the same ideas of sin and mercy as Isaiah here, but is speaking from the individual, from King David himself, rather than to a whole nation. Now look at the angel forgiving the sinner, wiping the slate clean. She wears green to symbolize new life and growth in the spirit, while another angel holds the slate up for scrutiny and to show us, the viewers, this journey mirrored in a new life in the spirit. The penitent woman has yet to see her sins forgiven, the slate being cleaned, as she's not yet ready to accept such mercy from God or to face the world and us, the viewers. So again, we are watching mercy in action, which here requires certain things to happen for it to fulfill its aim. Just as with the previous painting of the knight, as he accomplished an act of mercy, he then received God's mercy. So too here, mercy seems to come from making a shift in our life. However, God's mercy is greater than our capacity to repent. So these Victorian paintings reflect a particular theology of sin and forgiveness, which we may or may not agree with. Arthur Hughes wanted the picture and the frame to be as one and not separate parts in this interpretation, because God's mercy obviously has no edges or limits. Unlike the eye of the needle, which a rich man finds hard to go through, notice here just how wide this door of mercy is. In a time of pandemic, when we have had to shut our doors on all sorts of areas of our lives, this painting reminds us that for God, the door to him is always open and the slate can always be scrubbed clean. Do we share this truth as often as we could? Arthur Hughes paints this moment of grace in oil. Perhaps we can reflect on how this moment of grace can be shared in our church communities and in our lives right now. Our final painting is from John chapter 13, Jesus washing the disciples' feet. and which embraces all our themes of God communicating through unusual means, God giving us choices in life, and God showing us mercy and love through this particular act of service. Now, we know that John is the only gospel writer to tell this story, and this oil on canvas painting by the Victorian artist Ford Madox Brown captures this scandal perfectly. Let's be reminded of the significant text here. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" And Jesus answered, "You do not know now what I am doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." And Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." And Jesus said to him, "One who has bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you." For he knew who was to betray him. And for this reason, he said, "Not all of you are clean." Now notice how we have an unusually low viewpoint and compacted space in this painting to focus on what's happening below the table. And this creates intimacy and participation. We are not simply observing through this device, we are invited into the room with Jesus and the disciples. But this is a dangerous event for everyone, including us. Shortly after Jesus and his friends had celebrated the Passover together, Jesus rose from the table and began washing his friends' feet. Why was this significant? Unlike many other Jewish rituals, foot washing was not a ceremonial custom. It was important because people walked in sandals or barefoot through the dirty streets. But to wash someone else's feet was regarded by Jewish and Roman custom as one of the most demeaning tasks that anyone could perform, and not surprisingly was usually done by household slaves. Now at the Passover, there appeared to be no slaves around, so who is going to do this task? Well, the disciples could have washed their own feet when no servants or slaves were around. So for Jesus, the Son of God, to wash these smelly human feet was nothing short of a scandal. Now, Jesus had done some bizarre acts, speaking out against the Pharisees, challenging deep-rooted injustices, speaking freely with children, women, lepers, tax collectors, and prostitutes, and healing on the Sabbath. But the disciples really couldn't understand what point he was making here. Just look at their expressions around the table. Then Jesus calmly laid aside his outer garment. The Greek word in John's Gospel here, tithesin, means to lay aside. So as he lays aside his clothes, so I think he lays aside his divinity to wash those whom he loved. He would later have his clothes forcefully removed from him when he laid down his whole life on the cross. And he would himself lay his clothes very neatly aside in the tomb as he arose from the dead. So first, Jesus is not merely asking Peter to observe basic hygiene. He tells him that there is a spiritual significance to this simple task, which Peter won't understand until later. And later here in the Greek implies after Jesus' death. That we sin and we cannot clean ourselves. This spiritual washing will make the disciples totally clean, but they only need to do it once in this way. And perhaps that's a nod towards baptism. Second, Jesus is insistent. The disciples have to let him wash their feet, otherwise they can't have any real fellowship with him. So Peter's never, as in, "you will never wash my feet," in the Greek is an emphatic no, as in never ever in my lifetime, rather than a polite "no thank you, Jesus, not today if you don't mind awfully." So is Peter terrified? Does Peter really want to follow a God who makes him do this kind of stuff? Because then whose feet would he, Peter, now have to clean? Perhaps, since we notice that Peter addresses Jesus 3 times in this text, twice as Lord and once as you, that Peter subconsciously knows he will doubt Jesus at the end. He will deny him 3 times. And so this is a warning of what he can't fulfill. Or simply being even close to Jesus by letting him wash his feet is just too much. Better to remain at a psychological distance. Or is Peter genuinely sad for Jesus, that Jesus, his Lord and Master and friend, is debasing himself so much with this humiliating task? Is it actually a loving plea straight from the heart to Jesus to please retain some dignity here? But can Peter really expect to tell Jesus what he can and cannot do? In this painting, Jesus, in his grasshopper green robe, calmly continues washing Peter's feet. Look how focused he is on doing this job thoroughly, with a firm grasp of Peter's foot. And all the while a storm is brewing in Peter's head. You might just be able to see the frown marks, but you can definitely see his awkward, intense concentration, his posture and clenched hands. So then Peter thinks, well, why not wash all of me then? He will understand later. Jesus then explains the difference between a master and a servant. If the role of a slave or a servant and master are being reversed, we see how Jesus teaches us all a new lesson. But there is another interpretation in which Jesus is neither slave or servant or master, but an equal to the disciples. In this way, they are all on the same level or the same footing. And this gives us a different lesson entirely. Since if we become servants to each other, there is still a hierarchy in that model. But if we are equal, there is no hierarchy at all. The Pharisees and the Victorians were obsessed with hierarchies and protocol in public and in private. So this painting warns us that Jesus is changing these rules. The gospel story is central to our Christian journey here because it reverses the obsession with I and forces us to bend low, quite literally, to anyone we meet. If Jesus, our Saviour, will wash our feet, what can stop us too? Jesus washes all of his disciples' feet, and not just some of them, including Judas. Jesus' love is unconditional. It is not a selective love, but love as grace towards everyone, including those who betray him. To show Christ as divine, our artist paints the nimbus, but not for the disciples' benefit, but rather for us, the beholder. We know this as he paints the nimbus side on like a coin rather than horizontally around Jesus' head. And we see that Judas is represented on the far left, lacing up his sandals. His feet have already been washed. And we see his white money bag on the edge of the table, securing Jesus' imminent death. So we have Judas on the far left, and we have John, the beloved disciple, on the far right. Now, the Victorian art critics hated this picture. Originally, Jesus was half naked with a bare torso, as we see here. So perhaps have a quick look at that. Now, this painting, as you see it now, caused an absolute outcry when it was first exhibited. The idea of an utterly human, bare-chested Jesus in a domestic setting was a Victorian scandal that we cannot imagine today. They could cope with the Burne-Jones before outside with the night, but you couldn't show Jesus like this in the house. So it remained unsold for years until Ford Madox Brown very, very reluctantly painted clothes back on Jesus. Ford Madox Brown wanted to portray the shocked reactions of the disciples as wrong. They should, like Jesus, believe all people to be equal. He was also ridiculing the upper classes for their snobbery towards ordinary workers, without whom the Industrial Revolution would never have happened. Because at this time, across Europe, Marx and Engels had just published their Communist Manifesto on the rights of workers and the dangers of capitalist mass production. So our artist paints Jesus here as a strong manual labourer, so that Jesus is entirely associated with the working man, the class that the Victorian elite most despised and yet they most needed. A hypocrisy not unlike some of the Pharisees' behaviours towards Jesus. So finally, the real power here is foot washing, the power of radical transformative love and service. So that when Jesus died on the cross the next day, he was outstretched, outcast, outlived, but very definitely not outdone. Thank you.
Oh,
So thank you so much. That was amazing, actually, for somebody that has not focused on art much. I thought that was great. Fleur, I mean, I think you covered two points from my earlier comments, actually. I think a sense of awe, wonder, mystery, there is more to things than meet the eye has definitely come through your talk on those paintings. We were going to break out into breakout rooms, but I think actually there's a couple of questions now that we maybe think about, and it may well be worth just spending a couple of minutes thinking about them, and then maybe we could just feed back. But Fleur suggested two questions that we could just think about and maybe feed back in a plenary. One of them, which is which painting did you like best and why? And which paintings did you like least and why? Is one area. And then the other question was, where in your faith could art touch you most at this time? So there's a couple of areas there that may be worth just spending a minute to think about. And then Fleur, maybe we'll just come back and see if anybody's got any comments on to sort of pick up on what you've said. Has anybody got any immediate comments before we look at those two questions for Fleur, or should we spend a couple of minutes just thinking about those questions? Okay, so maybe it's 7:43. Maybe Fleur, if we have a few minutes, and if you want to take a drink, you can, and come back at maybe in 5 minutes time at what's that, 48, a couple of minutes time, and we'll come back and just see if anybody's got any comments. So the two questions were, which painting did you like best and why? And which painting did you like least and why? And where in your faith could art touch you most at this time? So maybe we just have a think about those, Fleur, and then come back. Thank you. Okay, for the last 10 minutes, shall we just sort of see if anybody's got any comments on the paintings that Fleur's taken us to? I guess, Fleur, just as by way of an opening question, how did you decide which paintings to talk us through from the myriad that there must be of paintings to choose from?
It's always really difficult but exciting to decide what you're going to do. But I suppose with those ones, I wanted to, because I didn't know who you are and I don't know what your interest in art is or anything about you. You're an unknown parish to me. I didn't want to go down the abstract line because I've tried that with some people and some people find that very difficult. So if I don't know people, I don't start with abstract art, but there's a lot you can do with abstract art. And then I wanted to have pictures that had a very clear narrative, because I think it's very easy to tell the story and the journey and the relationship with the Bible when the story and the painting actually is something, there's some substance to it. So that really helps, because there's lots of paintings that are sort of biblical or religious, but they don't actually have much that they're doing in the painting. So the more that it gives you, the easier it is to share that. And so those ones all do that for me, certainly. So, right. You know, they have a powerful narrative.
They do indeed. So I mean, just by way of introduction, the one painting that you didn't go through but you showed initially was one that the Return of the Prodigal Son, which was the book that was written, and I just found that, you know, that's the only book I've read on art really, and I just found that the most moving and incredible insight into that painting, and the whole book was written about it. And I guess, like some of the stuff that you've chosen tonight, you could write a whole book on some of these paintings.
Yeah, and that one has been done by a lot of people. So I purposely didn't talk about it because so many people already know about that one, where some of the ones that I've chosen, I know that most people have not even seen some of them. So they're more unusual, which makes it slightly more interesting in that way.
Brilliant, thank you.
Possibly more interesting, who knows? I think it's important people can say what they can't stand and what they really like. And I think it's important to have that permission with art.
Indeed. Anybody want to open us up with a comment?
I think the one I liked the best was The Balance.
Yeah, Mike, thank you. And why?
It's got a very good narrative story to it. But you really have to look at it very carefully and for quite a long time before you saw all the points that Fleur brought to our attention.
Thanks, Mike.
I love Vermeer. I'm half Dutch, so he's in my sort of DNA.
I thought it was very good, particularly the way the more traditional judgment painting was behind. So you saw both sides of it.
Yeah, it was very clever.
It was quite clever.
Indeed. No. Any other comments? Well,
I thought that the Merciful Night was best for me because it was one that I hadn't seen before. And so that had more impact, I think. Some of the others were sort of, oh, I've seen them before, you know, and sort of understood them. And the one I least liked, am I allowed to do that one as well?
yes,
Yes, okay. Was The Door of Mercy, because I thought it was a little bit twee and too explicit.
nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, that's why it's good to show as well, to see
Yeah,
what
contrast,
people
yeah.
are drawn to and
Yeah,
what they're not drawn, and to understand the context, because that context, that is exactly that style, isn't it?
Indeed. I think the cranes are off mute. So did you want to say something, guys?
I was just saying that the Vermeer makes you want to look at the other Vermeers to see if there is a deeper story behind the obvious, if you like, the obvious one, which I think would be really interesting.
Yeah, he doesn't do many biblical paintings, actually. That's
No.
another whole talk in itself, why he doesn't, but that one is.
I'd just be a bit controversial. I thought the one I liked best was actually the gentleman in armour being granted mercy, because it seemed to me that we are an aggressive race. We murder each other and cut each other down very easily. And it affected me to see mercy being given to someone who was a military man.
Yeah. I think it's very powerful that Jesus transcends all boundaries, all people. Whatever you're doing or have done, you know, he will lift himself off the cross and bend towards you. I mean, that in itself is so powerful, isn't it?
Great. And anybody got any answers to the second question, which is how do you think art could touch your faith at the moment? I think was it Fleur? It was something like that. How could what aspects of art could help you in your faith right now?
Well, the obvious one is there was one of Christ on the cross, which comes straight out of the Bible. It seemed to me to be very representative of the basis of our belief in Christianity.
Yeah.
And the Mercy Gate appealed to me in that it just reminds you of what Christ did. If we've repented, he wipes the slate clean. And it's simple things that register with me because I'm quite simple.
It was very powerful seeing that slate being wiped, wasn't it? I mean,
Yes.
unless you'd explained that to us there, you know, that would have just bypassed me completely.
And the woman's so penitent.
Yeah. And she can't look up. And you know, when you're in shame, you're like this. You don't want to look at people because you feel such shame. And that's exactly what she's doing. So it's good psychologically in that way.
It sort of summed up the gospel message.
Yeah.
Can I bring a different perspective to it?
Oh, please do. Add it
We
all.
were in Arizona last year,
No, not last year.
or the year before.
The year before.
I'll be corrected. And we went to the mission of San Xavier in the desert, which was the result of a dream by a person, and it was actually built later and decorated by the American Indians. And in it, there's a fresco of the Last Supper, which includes a portrait of the devil. And I have never seen that before. And I just, it had quite an effect on me, I'll put it that way. That somebody had actually had this dream of building a mission, and then the indigenous people had actually built it and created this painting of the Last Supper.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, I want to go and check that out, actually. I find it fascinating, the whole theology around the devil and Satan and, you know, the dark forces and all that. I find it really, really interesting how that's, A, the history of it, and B, how we might interpret it now in our current world.
Well, I said that to Vicky because Burnt Jones there you were talking about and being clothed and unclothed. He did it, and from what you were saying, I mean, I don't know, but from what you were saying, presumably he was selling the painting and couldn't, and therefore clothed the picture.
Oh, the Ford Maddox Brown, the last one, yeah.
In order to sell it. So, was he selling his soul?
Well, indeed. Or was he just having to pay off his mortgage?
One never knows. Did he have a mortgage?
It's a difficult.
Does he want some advice?
But that whole debate was going on pre-Caravaggio, what you can and cannot paint, what do you actually want to paint as an artist, and what are you allowed to paint or portray, and all of those rules are very complicated, aren't they?
They are, yeah.
And we still debate now with, should we be painting Jesus as white Western in the first place when he's Mediterranean, and not white? There's all sorts of issues, and Mary as well. There's so many issues about that now. What we're comfortable with and what we're not comfortable with, but what actually is the truth. And if there's one person who can deal with Satan, it's definitely God. So actually, in one sense, if Satan is at the Last Supper, Jesus can definitely deal with that. We couldn't, but Jesus can. That's the whole point, surely.
Indeed. Fascinating. And art has a big impact on even things that we talk about today, doesn't it? So the halo that we see Jesus with, that was never mentioned in the Bible, but everybody knows what it is now because of art. That's the reason we know about the halo of around Jesus's head.
Not just Jesus.
But brilliant. It's just coming up to the hour. Has anybody got any other comments, or should we wrap it up? We're very happy to take any other comments people might have. Excellent. Well, Fleur, thank you so much. I think this whole idea of an ability to be still and to look carefully at art, you've really helped us with tonight in that 1 hour. And it's a really powerful skill, I think, that we all need to, or certainly I need to develop. And I think what you've done with us tonight has really helped. So I guess on behalf of St. Saviour's and Brockenhurst Churches, thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thank you. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I hope you all look at lots more art.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for that. Thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.